Hi, Alexi from CodePrinciples.com here. So for today's lesson, we will talk about Android data binding and specifically binding layouts. And we'll focus on layouts part of it, and in the next lesson we'll go into the code part in more detail. But in this lesson you'll still see some code. So it all begins with a layout tag. To enable data binding, you have to wrap your layout in layout tag. That way the library will know to process your layout and do its magic, whether it is to generate code or other things. It will pick up layouts that are wrapped in layout tag. So to get started in the activity, you have to create your content view in a slightly different way than before. So we have to call set content view on the data binding utils object and pass it the current activity and the layout ID that you want to create and use. So the generated binding name of the layout is the layout plus binding appended to the end. So for example, our layout is called activity main.xml, and the generated binding will be called activity main binding, as you can see in the example below. Here's our layout ID, and here's the resulting binding, and we can use this binding. We will go into details more about that later. So we've covered activities. What about fragments, and what about other places like custom views and adapters? So to inflate your layouts and to get the binding object, you have to use data binding util class again, but call inflate, passing the inflator, the layout ID, the container, and whether you want to attach to the parent UI element or not. So you need to do this in fragments, adapters, and custom views. And this is an example of fragment. And this is how you'd inflate your layout using Android data binding. You call the inflate on data binding util, pass the inflator that we have as one of the parameters in on create view, then the layout ID, the parent container, and whether we want to attach it to the parent. And then to return the view which our onCreate view requires, we call binding get root, which gives the view, reference to the view. So the next example is custom view. This is a constructor for a custom view, and here pretty much the same approach as with the fragment. An adapter example. So on create view holder is where we want to inflate, like we would normally in the adapter. And here again we call the inflate function on the data binding utils class with the inflator, layout ID, and the parent, and we get our binding back. Then again, using the recycler pattern, we have our view holder that takes a binding. It's a custom subclass of a view holder, and we just call the supers constructor here with the view. Again, we do binding get root to pass the view to the parent. So next, layout elements and expressions. Android data binding allows us to have a very powerful and versatile syntax in our layouts. And to start, let's go into the details of this. So you can create a variable tag inside of the data tag, and like you see here. And again, remember to have both inside your layout tag, and then below we'll have your content, anything like linear layout, relative layout, coordinator layout, and all the other layouts or views that you want to put. So we have to define the name for our variable. Here it is text var, and the type, which is it is a string, but it can also be any complex object like any model or anything. You just have to give it a fully qualified name, so meaning package and then the class name here. And then we can use our variable in any of the attributes in our layout by having the at squiggly line and then variable and close squiggly line. And here we can access our variable. Here it's a string, so our text for the text view is going to be set. But we can also do other things with the variables. We'll go into details later. And next we have to pass the values from our Java code through the binding object. So here is the example in our activity class, or you can do fragments or custom views or adapter. As you've seen in the previous example, we first create our content view or inflate in the case of fragment or adapter custom view, and then the data binding generated class has a setter already defined for our variable. Remember, our variable was called text var, and the setter is therefore set text var, and it takes a correct type, which we define string type here. Also, sometimes you will have to import certain namespaces, packages, classes in your layout to use. Again, we have an import tag, and you add it to inside the data tag. Here you see import tag. We import android.text.textutils, and we can do textutils.get reverse, which reverses the string, and then the start position and end position in the string, and it gives us reversed string with reversed characters. And you can do anything, as you'll see in the next lessons. We also have a powerful expression language. You can do mathematical operators, binary operators, instance of array access, and so much more. So here's an example. We can do a mathematical operation, and we can do a comparison, and then a ternary operator, and if true, we can call a function. If false, we can create a string literal. And you can see that's very useful in cases where you want to move some of your UI logic from your activity or any other class into actual UI. to keep the activity or presenter or custom views code cleaner. Here's an example of us using a list. So to define a generic list, unfortunately, we can't put the proper less than and greater than signs around the generic type, but we'll have to use the encoded values of them. So here, and then we can do list get item at index 0. If it's instance of string, then we do a cast of that item, else we can do that object dot to string. Again, it's very powerful in a lot of situations. And we can also pass the variables to the layouts included using the include tag in our XML layouts. As you can see in this example here, we have two variables, first name and last, type of string, and then we have an included layout, and there we pass the first name and last name right there. So in our layouts, we can have we can reference resources to use with our variables, our logic, our expressions. So for example, what we can do is, depending on some boolean, we can then set width to a specific dimension using a ternary operation. And then we can also provide a default value. We can also do the string plurals that we've defined for a word banana, and depending on the count, it will either be text banana or bananas plural. Next, what we can do is we can do string format with the strings defined in our string resources with placeholders. And here we have a first and last name string that pretty much just displays first name, that's passed, then word and last name. And that is all for today's lesson, and hopefully you can see how powerful Android data binding library can be. And in the next lesson, we'll go into more advanced examples of how to use Android data binding library.